All right, guys, let's crack on. So Ursula's going to pick up where we left off and address a few of those points. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just say on this question of whether
Can we close the door for those that are leaving?
On this question of whether the appeal of let's talk about the gated compounds that have been built in the last 5 to 10 years rather than satellite cities, which are of earlier generation, generally speaking, and in some cases more successful. Can you hear me? I was just going to say briefly, in terms of the appeal of, and I'll refer to the gated private compounds that have been built in, let's say, the last 10, 15-year span, rather than what generally is called satellite cities, which is more the state-sponsored projects, some of which, like you say, 6th of October being a prime example, have been relatively successful, or some of the more industrial cities that have been relatively successful. So let's focusing on the appeal of some of the more recent, completely privately owned gated suburbs. I actually so the idea that their appeal is part of a post-colonial cultural legacy. Now, obviously, there's a long history in the sort of splits in the fabric of Cairo, and the original one being the split between Islamic Cairo and what we now call downtown Cairo. And there was a sort of fracture, and there was a lot of this opposition between what was considered at the time the backwards Cairo and the modern, Western-looking elite Cairo. So there is this sort of colonial history to these divisions and to these migrations and to these moves. That said, I don't read the appeal of these places as having anything particularly to do with Egyptian culture or with Egypt's colonial history, because these kinds of developments appeal the world over. And as we had someone in the audience saying, they've been very successful in the States forever until a strong, which took a very long time, grassroots movements against them has sort of had some success, and there's been a revalorization of downtowns. But the appeal of, the 2-garage, yard with sprinklers, fancy house works seemingly everywhere. So I don't think that there's anything particular about those kind of marketing campaigns working here. And of course they work on these, very general, like exclusivity, luxury, be among your own kind, have a perfect life, in opposition to some genuine problems in the city in terms of pollution and traffic and overcrowding, although of course in fact they make traffic worse, but advertising campaigns don't have to be rational, they just have to work. In terms of this conversation, which I've enjoyed a lot, and I'm unfortunately going to have to head out, I would say for me what I'm taking away from the conversation is, on the one hand, I think we've explored a lot, whether it's useful or not to engage in this kind of, to look at Cairo as this divided landscape and to sort of be part of that divisiveness in trying to figure out whether the people who choose to go live out there, are traitors to the city or parasites or whatever. And I think we've reached a conclusion it's not particularly useful to, argue over, do these people have the right to do this? What I think is useful, and is the conclusion from what I hear from everybody here, is to call for a more transparent look at the allocation of state resources, so that people are paying the real price for their decisions, and state resources are being divided in a fair way. And the other thing I take away from this conversation is the question of, why are people leaving the city? And it makes you have to look at the city, the existing historical city, and the problems of governance there. And these enormous problems that need to be solved So you can reverse this policy of saying Central Cairo is a failure, and the only option is escape, and you know, starting over somewhere else. And I think, you know, that's where, you know, if the revolution doesn't succeed, that is probably going to be accelerated. I think, you know, institutions like AUC are probably patting themselves on the back for moving out to where they did, considering what downtown Cairo has been like this year. I'm sure that the administrators are happy with that decision, and I would suspect that, you know, we've seen the walls, I don't think that there's going to be interest on the part of people you know, who are anti-revolutionary in creating the kind of public spaces where people can congregate easily. So, you know, for Cairo to improve, you know, things have to go well politically, because the shape of the city is so linked to issues of governance. And, you know, if they do, there is more autonomy for municipal councils, if good people run and become part of those councils in the elections that should happen sometime in the next year, if people, you know, conduct serious research and are able to publicize it on what the costs of urban decisions and urban policies are, if a new parliament, for example, decides to have a serious, you know, urban planning or housing committee, I mean, these are maybe some options going forward. But I was very happy to be here tonight. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I just wanted to, this might not be the right place, but well, it just came up, so there's a kind of a myth that I feel like I need to at least interrogate or debunk, which is the relationship between where we are now, 19th century Cairo, with the previous part of Cairo. Cities are cumulative, they always build on whatever is already there, and they grow. And also they reflect, you know, the times. There's no reason that 19th century Cairo should have followed urban patterns of 14th century Cairo. It makes sense that it looks significantly different because that was the biggest, you know, sort of in scale jump for a long time. It took 100 years. It wasn't built overnight. It's not like the Paris process, and it wasn't in spite of the existing city. We forget that with the building of downtown, with the modern Cairo, there was also the founding of the Comité de Conservation, which was made as an institution to maintain the previous city, historic Cairo. We don't have this today. And this brings me to Munar's point, which is the cultural aspect, because of course cities have to grow, and yes, the model that we're talking about is one that's found in California and elsewhere. And that's fine. But the real break here is the relationship between this new growth and then the city as it exists. And I think what we're seeing with a lot of these communities is a willful amnesia between citizens who occupy such spaces and the city as it exists. Which brings me to that point about the AUC students not even knowing where one of the two famous islands are in the city. This is willful amnesia, and this is something that you don't find in other societies that have similar compounds, but have also maintained there's a lot of cultural connection between the elite. I mean, you go into any museum institution in big cities, which are usually in the center, and you'll see a big plaque with names of wealthy families who've contributed financial sums to maintain those institutions. Even if they live in Orange County, they have a relationship to the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco or something. I mean, I'm talking about a very particular segment in society, but that doesn't exist really here. The Egyptian Museum doesn't get a penny from anybody who's wealthy in this country because they have all the money to spend on luxury goods that are, you know, part of international trade and so on. Not museums, not culture, not the city as it exists. That relationship is really damaged. And this is why I think we're talking about something new and a significant shift, because if this generation that is that's growing up in those contexts don't really realize or don't have something like the comité that takes care of 19th century Cairo, 20th century Cairo, Nasr City is a dramatic shift, but it still was built on a relationship to the existing city. I mean, you were still a bureaucrat, a middle class person, whatever, who occupied it, but you still came to Metro Cinema to go to the movies. that relationship is not there, and I think we need to maintain this. And to do so, we need, legal reforms, but also a serious discourse on different levels of society. I think the haves really need to start speaking to the have-nots somehow. And people really need to rediscover what this place is really about, this city is really about. We're really suffering from the result of 60 years of no cultural history. I mean, if you read any good book that's been written about Egypt's modern history, cultural history, chances are it was either done by an academic in a university abroad or by an Egyptian working in a university abroad writing about Egypt, and we have had such little discourse, and I think this is a significant problem. Yeah. So